Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another THF Members Conversation. My name is Matt Anderson. I'm the Curator of Transportation at the Henry Ford, and today we're going to be talking about transportation in its most extreme form, I think, in regard to our current exhibit showing right now in Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. It is Apollo When We Went to the Moon. And if you haven't seen it yet already, by all means, get down there and check it out. It has more than 100 objects and artifacts from the archives of the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. It explores our efforts to get to the moon in the 1960s. It features detailed models of various rockets, both the U.S. and Soviet space programs, as well as uniforms. And maybe my favorite part, you even get to touch a piece of the moon, so you can't beat that. But we are very fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Kay Taylor. And Dr. Taylor is the Director of Education at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, where she oversees programming at the Smithsonian Affiliate Rocket Center and Space Camp, which is the world leader in immersive space science STEM education. And in addition to seeing the educational program there, Taylor also leads the Rocket Center's educational partnerships among academia, industry, and government entities, which is what brings her in our orbit, if you'll pardon the pun. And Kay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Great. And I will say at the outset to our members, I'm going to ask some questions of her, of course, to get the program started. But if you have questions of your own, please submit them in the chat. And then we will go through those and select some to ask at the end of the program. So everyone hopefully will get a chance to weigh in on the conversation. But Kay, let's just start kind of right at the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit about the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, its missions, its holdings, its activities?
Certainly. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center is one of the original space museums in the country. We opened our doors in 1970, and the planning was well underway for this facility before we landed successfully on the moon. Our mission is to inspire and educate through the power of space exploration. We focus on Huntsville's historic role in propulsion and space exploration. And we also not only tell the story of the history, but we continue to tell Huntsville's role in the present and the future. It's the holdings we have literally thousands of artifacts of flown hardware, test hardware, documentation, from original rocket scientists through astronauts who are preparing to land on the moon in the Artemis program.
Terrific. And I'm sure some of our members have heard about the Space Camp program, and enormously popular. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, the purpose and the goal behind Space Camp.
Sure, I would love to. So Space Camp has been changing young people's lives since 1982. We are about to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Space Camp this summer. And in that time, we've had 1 million young people come through, take part in the immersive environment that we have here at the Rocket Center, walk amongst this hardware, take part in engineering challenges, and work together on simulated missions. And through that program, they're able to envision a future of themselves, and they're able to think and see how they could bring their best self forward. And so in addition to Space Camp was the original program. We've now added to our family of Space Camp programs, and we have Aviation Challenge, which is focused on aviation technology. We have a robotics camp, and our newest program is cyber focused camp, U.S. Cyber Camp. And all of these programs work together through technical education, through working on development of soft skills and emotional and social learning together through complementary activities. So we have, it's an ecosystem for immersive STEM learning, and it's international in nature now. Literally before COVID, students were coming from around the world to take part in this program. Coming out of COVID, we will be fleeting back up again this summer, and we're hoping that we'll be able to see some of our internationals return. But for our students here in the U.S., we will continue on even through COVID, we did not completely lose our space camp programming. We worked to make sure our students were safe, and we've been able to continue our mission through some very tough challenges. And I know that a lot of museums and centers across the country have really struggled. So I think we're all coming out of something, and we're looking forward to better days.
Yeah, we can empathize with you on the challenges, but that's great to hear that you've persisted and carried through. Well, let's talk a little bit about the exhibit Apollo When We Went to the Moon. And I should point out it's on view right now at Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. It will show through May 8th, and there's no additional charge for the exhibit. It's included with your museum admission. Of course, if you're a member, you don't even have to worry about that. So by all means, come see it. But tell us about the exhibit. When was it put together, and what were your goals and purposes behind it?
Certainly. We began work on Apollo When We Went to the Moon in 2018. We were anticipating the summer of 2019 to be a fantastic celebration of the 50th anniversary of the successful Apollo 11 lunar landing. So we have at the Rocket Center, we have had a history of putting together exhibits, both for display here in Huntsville and that travel. And we were working with an Australian partner of ours, Flying Fish, and we had successfully put together an exhibit in 2015. We knew 2019 was coming, and this was the story that we were positioned to tell like no other story. We wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of humans stepping foot on another celestial body. But we didn't just want to tell a story of technology. We wanted to tell the story in the context of the times. We wanted to tell this huge technological story in the context of the people who put it together and what was going on. And the lessons that we learned in putting this story together, and how we interpreted the times. I think there are some lessons that carry forward to where we are today, coming out of COVID and still looking at some uncertain times ahead. I think there's a lot to learn from this amazing story of focus and purpose and unlikely partners coming together to achieve an incredible goal.
You mentioned unlikely partners, and I think the Apollo program and the space race in general cannot be separated from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I wondered if you might set that stage for us. Frankly, in the early 60s, how did the Soviets' achievements in space compare with those of the US?
Sure. So there's no way to talk about space exploration in the early days without taking into consideration that space was the next military theater. It was the high ground. And the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle here on Earth. And whomever achieved the high ground would certainly have an advantage. So that's how it began. And quite frankly, if you're looking at just tracking milestones, the initial Soviet milestones outpaced the US milestones. The Soviets had the first satellite in orbit, Sputnik, which really kicked off the space race. So they had the first satellite into orbit. They ended up with the first human going into space, the first animal successfully launched and returned, the first woman in space. I mean, the Soviets throughout the space race were making faster strides and hitting more milestones. But when the ultimate goal for the US was to land on the moon, and that's where the energy went, the US ended up winning the space race, if that's how you define it. But if you were awarding a point system, I have to say that the Soviets scored a lot of points with the milestones they reached.
Well, I think we could probably trace the Apollo program's origins to a specific speech given by President Kennedy, right, in 1961, as he addresses a joint session of Congress. And he basically puts it out there. He says, I challenge this country to put a man on the moon, return him safely to Earth, not a small point, but to do so before the end of this decade. And that's in 1961. So the clock is already running on that goal.
Right, right.
How ambitious was that, especially given the state of the American space program at that moment?
Right. It was pretty audacious. It was pretty audacious to put a decadal time frame on it, but because the Soviets had launched Yuri Gagarin, and the U.S. responded in large part by the engineering successes here in Huntsville to launch Alan Shepard. And so Kennedy felt this was the imperative, that the Soviets were clearly in a position to own space. And so he put the most audacious challenge forward of not launching, 100 miles into orbit, but to travel 250,000 miles, land on the moon, and then return that craft back to Earth. A bold statement. And then to say by the end of the decade, um, but that was the challenge issued, and that was the challenge met.
One of our signature artifacts at the museum, and I know a lot of our members will be familiar with this, we have a series of presidential limousines, including the 1961 Lincoln Continental, which happened to be the one President Kennedy was using in Dallas in November of 1963. And of course, you can't talk about Kennedy and the space program without talking about his assassination. And what effect did Kennedy's death have on the program? Was that an extra source of motivation? Was it a moment to stop and think perhaps we shouldn't do this? What were the effects?
Well, it could have stopped the space program dead in its tracks. I mean, it could have stopped it. The timeline was so compressed. I mean, here you have Kennedy issuing the challenge to Congress in 61. In 1962, he gives the speech at Rice University, which is where he utters the famous phrase, "We choose to do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard." So, I mean, Kennedy was really embodying the challenge. And with the loss of Kennedy, it could have been the loss of the entire program. But to his credit, Lyndon Johnson, in bringing the country together to mourn the loss of Kennedy, he put space as one of those signature programs. He put that before the country and said, this will be part of the legacy to the leader we just lost. And so he addressed the country in the Thanksgiving period after the assassination in what was known as the "Let Us Continue" address to the American public. And in that, he said that the space program and space exploration should be part of Kennedy's legacy. And so that gave it the impetus to continue. And, it was of course, President Johnson who was able to see, who was able to see it through and see eventually that there was a successful landing. But it could have, with political programs, it could have gone either way. It would have been easy for President Johnson to say, we have so many challenges here at home. There are so many challenges here in the world. We will focus on this. But he didn't back away from it because he knew that it was important.
Yeah, it's a testament to Johnson and his vision that he's doing all of this at the same time he's fighting the war on poverty and taking care of domestic programs as well. So important point.
And that's one of the things that I think is important about the exhibit. As we put the exhibit together, we tried not to tell just a technical story, but we tried to put this challenge for the moon in the context of one of the most turbulent decades that our nation had gone through. And some would say that the world had gone through, which was, of course, the 60s. And in that time frame, not only here at home, but throughout the world, countries, nations, peoples were kind of fraying and coming apart at the seams. Here in this country, we had the Vietnam War. We had the struggle for civil rights. We had the women's movement starting to take hold. We had young people not seeing eye to eye with older generations. There was a lot going on. And when you looked across the globe, you had a lot of change. You had colonialism. The sun was beginning to set on the British Empire, if you will. You had Pan-Arabism, you had Pan-Africanism, you had places that had been part of something becoming independent. And then with like the Soviets and with China, you had geopolitical areas that were coming under the influence of other larger systems. So there was a lot of give and take, and there was a lot of heat and friction. And through that audacious challenge, you saw this amazing technological achievement reached.
Thank you for making that point. You're right. One of the things the exhibit does brilliantly is set this program in its context. The thought of going to the moon by itself is amazing enough, but with all of these other things happening at the same time, really such a revolutionary time. And as you said, a decade, hopefully not to be repeated in terms of some of the issues that we were dealing with and so much going on at one time. On that note, let's talk a little bit about the exhibit. And I wondered if you had some favorite objects in there, or perhaps some stories that surprised you as you were putting it together.
It is an artifact-rich exhibit, and of course, every artifact tells a story. I love, as you're in the exhibit, you're seeing the representation of those different social movements and points of friction through the exhibit of focusing on civil rights, the Vietnam War, the hippie movement in Woodstock. And then you step around and you see the uniform of one of the pad technicians that would have worked at the Apollo launch site. And we put that figure in there to represent the thousands who worked to put humans on the moon. It wasn't simply a story of one or two great individuals. Truly, the moonshot, the reason it was so compelling was that there was so much involvement in it. And by the time of the Apollo 11 landing, there was, if you will, buy-in from the world. There was excitement that this technology was coming full circle. But when I look at the exhibits, one thing that amazes me, there is a point in the exhibit. It's called A Close Call, and it is it's a video representation of landing the Apollo 11 lander, and you have Armstrong manually flying, looking through this tiny triangular window, and he's trying to identify the place to set the lander down, because when they were coming in, it was more rocky than they had anticipated. And so he's literally trying to find the space to set the lander down. You don't want to come in and hit a rock and, have a collapse here after a 250,000 mile good journey. So he is flying, and the control in Houston is like, how's it going? It's going good, just trying to find a place to sit down. And he finds the spot, and when he sets the lander down, he has about 30 seconds left in the gas can, if you will. He has about 30 seconds worth of fuel left before he would have just been flying with no way to mitigate the landing. That's how close it was. There were all of these points, so you think, well, it was a pretty big launch. Well, we secured the launch. Oh, we're into orbit, going great. Going around the moon, everything's smooth. landing on the moon, they come within 30 seconds of expending their fuel. And through it all, Armstrong's heart rate, it was elevated because it was an exciting time, but through it all, his heart rate remained steady. I can't even tell that story without my heart rate jumping at the thought of it.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and you're right. I was drawn to that story about his heart rate being comparatively low considering the situation he was in.
Ice water in his veins.
Yeah, incredible. Well, I'll use my privilege as host here. I want to ask about a couple of my favorite artifacts in there. And I should say, first and foremost, is the Curator of Transportation. I love that there's a full-size replica of the Lunar Rover in there. So, and not just to look at, you can actually climb in, you can sit behind the wheels, so to speak, and a great place for a photo and to think about driving around the moon. How cool that must have been. But a couple of pieces that really jumped out at me. First of all, sort of near the opening portions of the exhibit, there was a drafting kit, a set of tools that were used by Wernher von Braun, and then there was a slide rule that was used by his counterpart, Sergei Korolev, I believe. And it's astonishing to stop and think about all the work that was being done in the space program at that time, up to and including successfully landing on the moon. And this is being done before an age of pocket calculators or really even practical computers. I mean, they were doing all of this by hand, essentially, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. All hand calculations. There were no massive computer banks running simulation after simulation after simulation. No, all calculated by hand. And Korolev, you mentioned Sergei Korolev. He was the almost unknown project manager of the Soviet program, and his identity really did not come forward until many years later. But on his team, his engineers called Korolev's slide rule his magic wand, because he could manipulate it so quickly. It was never far from him, and he could manipulate it and get his calculations like no one else. And that's, we have amazing digital simulations today, where you can run through so many scenarios. But in the original moonshot, all calculated with a slide rule, all calculated by hand.
It makes my heart elevated just to think about that, or my heart rate. Well, another item that really struck me is, in terms of its physical presence as an artifact, it's maybe one of the most understated pieces. It's just a couple of pieces of paper, but this is a cable sent from the Soviet Space Agency to NASA on the 19th July 1969, as I recall. So just before we're getting ready to land with Apollo 11. And some people might not realize, but at the same time the U.S. is on its way to the moon, there's a Soviet satellite, right, Luna 15, that's orbiting the moon at that very moment. And in this cable, the Soviets are saying, we've adjusted the orbit, this is the course, so that the Americans wouldn't essentially crash into it, so it wouldn't interfere with the landing. And here's the climax, in a sense, of the space race between the U.S. and the USSR. And in effect, you've got cooperation represented in that cable, right?
Absolutely. We like to think of that as perhaps the first documented example of these two combatants and these two ideologies, these two peoples, these two nations that are competing for a common goal, actually working together in the moment so that the common goal can be achieved. Absolutely. The Soviets wanted to land on the moon first. Oh my gosh, are you kidding? But when they saw that the American mission was progressing, they did what they could. They basically said, our satellite will not interfere with your mission. And that may have laid the groundwork for what was then to come in later space programs as we moved into the era of the Soyuz and the Apollo program, which became the Apollo-Soyuz program, which was the first joint operation in space between the two nations that then led to where we are today with the International Space Station, where the U.S. and now Russia are, co-owners of the U.S. space station, and we have international participation. That's an almost unthinkable point to be at when you're when you're in 1969, and the stakes are high, and the two sides are very much competing for the high ground. But it was amazing, and it showed the power of space to be a realm where there could be scientific achievement paired with diplomacy. And even as we speak today on the International Space Station, there are American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts coexisting in a space 250 miles above our head, and they're working together. That's a powerful statement right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the space program and the moon landing in particular, with the passage of time, it's one of those events we can appreciate, not really as an American achievement, but as a human achievement, right? People working together and achieving amazing things. Well, on that note, I think it's fair to say that American involvement in space feels very different now, right? We read the headlines, we're hearing about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, right, launching rockets and carrying William Shatner into space for the first time, right? An achievement in its own right. But there was really, this is nothing new, right? There was never a time during Apollo when you didn't have all kinds of private industries and contractors working on this program, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I believe the statistic is that it required 400,000 people to put one person on the moon. NASA was of course the scientific lead, but they depended on the intellectual abilities of the private contractors who worked with them, the Rockwells, the Martins, the Boeings of the world. I mean, there have always been scientific contractors who worked with our space program, and we're now at a point where we're seeing private companies established with that as their goal. And you mentioned SpaceX, and you mentioned Blue Origin. There are other companies that are now able to launch satellites into space, something that in the early days of the space program, it was under the provenance of NASA. We're seeing space tourism becoming a concept that people are excited about. We do have visionaries who are looking to make life on Earth better through what we learn about pushing into space. And Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos are both looking at life off this planet to hopefully make it better on this planet, because anything they figure out how to do up there is probably going to help us here as well. There's a lot of talk right now of, should the billionaires be, doing this in space when there are so many problems here on Earth? But it should never be looked at, in my opinion, as an either or proposition, because just because one thing is happening does not mean something else isn't happening. And there has always been the discussion, should resources be used for space exploration when we have problems to solve here on Earth? Well, the advances in space exploration may lead to developments that make the difference here on Earth. So we'll see. But it is definitely a great time for space exploration, and for the potential for more people to take part. We're seeing civilians go into space. It's not just a government program hand selecting a certain type of individual to go into space. Commerce is opening the way for many different people to go to space.
This is the part of the interview that always makes me nervous because I study history, right? So I don't like prognostication, but we've got to talk a little bit about the future. Where
Sure.
do you think we're going next? Are we going to go back to the moon? Maybe we'll even go there in a semi-permanent way with a lunar base. And following that, how far away, how achievable is Mars? I think that's the next big goal, right?
Yes, and I firmly believe in my lifetime, um, which is, the grayer I get. That's a pretty bold statement. Uh, I firmly believe we'll do both. I think that NASA is putting in place the program to return us to the moon. Just because we've been there doesn't mean we've been there, done that, and bought the T-shirt. There's so much more to learn about the moon. There is so much more to learn about living off the Earth, what sustainability away from our home planet means. Um, I think the moon is absolutely returning to the moon, staying on the moon is integral to space exploration. But the big challenge is, can we get to Mars? And clearly, there are people and there are companies that are focused on getting to Mars. In terms of level of difficulty, um, the ISS is about 250 miles above Earth, and it has been orbiting the Earth for 22 years. And people have lived off the planet continually for 22 years. It's a short ride back to Earth if you need to return to Earth quickly. The moon is about 250,000 miles away. Takes a couple of days to get there, a couple of days to get back. Uh, it is a harsh environment. The moon will want to kill you. Mars. Mars is about 250 million miles away. Using the correct orbital positions for launch, it'll take you 8 months to get to the moon. To Mars. Once you get to Mars, you have to wait for that right alignment to make it back in 8 months efficiently. So when you get to Mars, you're going to hang around a while. And so a trip to Mars and back is probably about a 3-year investment. We have got to have things down pat to do that mission, simply because of the time involved. But when you look at the breathtaking advances that are going on right now, do I think that there are people, there are companies, there are countries, perhaps a consortium of all of those? Will we get to Mars? I think we will. And I hope we have a heck of a party when we do, just as the world did when humans set foot on the moon in 1969.
Well, I'll ask you one more question to kind of close out our portion on the exhibit. And this is one I always like to ask of folks. We all know that inevitably, when you're putting a story together like this, you have to leave some parts out, whether it's because of space, budget, whatever it might be. Are there artifacts or stories that you wished you might have been able to include in this exhibit, but couldn't for one reason or another?
There's one thing that there's something I wish we had done in the exhibit that sort of helps explain maybe how that moonshot pivoted from being the US against the Soviets, us against them, to the world being able to celebrate the achievement of the American astronaut setting foot on the moon. And I think that we failed to include one artifact that maybe would have bridged that. And I think that is the photo, the iconic Earthrise photo that was taken in the Apollo 11 mission. It was transmitted back, what's called the Christmas mission, because Apollo 11 circled the moon, just skating above the surface. They were not allowed to land, and NASA was a little terrified that the astronauts were going to try and land on Apollo 8. That was not their mission. But they were flying above the moon, and they captured the image of the Earth rising in space, and you see the lunar surface. And it was the first time we had truly looked upon the Earth as home and as completely separate. And I don't know, it's this amazingly still, beautiful, quiet photo. And I think that something about that image may have helped pivot from this being an American mission to reach the moon to becoming the global celebration it became when Armstrong set foot on the moon, because it was an event that was viewed around the world through the modern miracle of television. The world was able to take part in that landing and that celebration. And I just wonder if that Earthrise photo didn't somehow create the space for it to become, no pun intended, for that landing to become a celebration of our planet and not the celebration of one individual or one nation, because the world threw a party for Apollo 11. So I hope that when we get to Mars, that I'm still able to enjoy a good party.
I love it. Well, I'm glad you brought up that Earthrise photo too, because you're talking about all the other things that were going on in the U.S. in the 60s. And I think about the environmental movement, which we tend to associate more with the early 70s. But I have to believe that seeing Earth from space like that played a role in people's new consciousness about the environment.
Yeah. But certainly when you contrasted with the surface of the moon, which is just gray, it's gray and like talcumy, rocky surface, is lifeless, is cold. And there you see the beautiful Earth with the greens and the blues and the clouds. It's just, it was a moment. So.
Well, we'll open the floor up here to some of our members here who have submitted questions, and I'll run some of these past. The first one is about America and experiments with docking in space. And I think the question is whether the Americans did the first docking between two spacecraft or not. I know there's some discussion of the Americans and the Russians docking spacecraft together in the exhibit.
I will have to look into that. If I can follow up with you and we have a later Facebook posting. I don't want to misspeak on that. I know that we have several examples of docking maneuvers in our museum, but I want to make sure that I don't overstep, because if that was yet another Soviet advancement, I don't want to rob them of that.
Understood. Absolutely. Next question here. I think you may have answered this, but you're talking about Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, the touch and go situation. What was his heart rate there? Did you say 120 or?
It's actually 150. And to me, that's like, oh God, okay, is his heart about to explode? But apparently, you can perform at that, but it never went above that. Wow. I mean, it's like for the last 3 minutes, his heart, because he was engaged, it never went above that. So it was definitely elevated, but you would think if you were fully aware that you were about to run out of fuel, that it might become even more so.
No, the stakes don't get much higher than what he was facing then. So that's great. Someone asked about the Lunar Rover in the exhibit, the story behind that, and perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about that vehicle, not the original, not an actual used on the Moon rover, right?
No. That was definitely crafted for the exhibition, but the Lunar Rovers were tested here in Huntsville, and we have some amazing docents in our own museum here that actually worked on the rover program, and they were able to work with us to make sure that the replication was technically accurate. And it's really fun to look at the wheels of the rover, which are are all metal. There was no way you could put a pneumatic tire on the moon. It would explode. So they had to have a wheel designed that would keep the rover from sinking into the surface, because initially they were not sure how deep the regolith layer was. And they could tell that it was very fine particulate, but they didn't know if it was essentially a dry quicksand, and that with weight you would just sink. So so they worked on developing a wire mesh wheel technology that allowed the rover to cover distance without sinking. It was almost like, for me as a non-engineer, it was almost like the way a snowshoe technology will keep you from sinking into soft powder. That's what they developed for the rover, and it served them well through the Apollo program.
Excellent. And I always love to point out, if you come to the exhibit and look at that Lunar Rover, go over to Driving America after that and take a look at Henry Ford's quadricycle from 1896. Even though they're decades apart and hundreds of thousands of miles apart, there's a striking similarity in the form of those two vehicles, just four-wheeled propelled vehicles. So an interesting connection across very different timelines. But we had another question I think I can answer. Someone was asking where the moon rock is that you can touch in the exhibit. And as you go through the exhibit, you'll see you've recreated what looks like an appliance store with some televisions in the windows that are showing footage of Armstrong as he steps onto the moon. And just past that, there's what looks like basically a slice of the moon that you can reach in and touch. And you better believe I touched it. Really cool. You don't get to do that too often. But if I'm not mistaken, I think NASA gave moon rocks to all the states at one point, didn't they, as sort of a gesture of goodwill or support for the program? I know I've seen some of them out there. But
NASA, and particularly Johnson Space Center in Houston, is the repository of the moon rocks that NASA holds. Okay. And they have a definite protocol for organizations or states to obtain them. I know that we have on site a moon rock that is on loan to us from NASA Johnson, and there are definite protocols you have to follow. There are definitely security measures you have to follow to ensure that the safety and security of these very precious artifacts.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly into another question we had submitted here, and that is, at what point did people start saving these items as artifacts? Was that a conscious thing going on throughout the program? They knew they had to hold on to some of these things for historical significance, or did that come a little later?
Oh, that's a good question, because in some sense, many people knew that they were working on historic. They were doing historic work, whether they were working with the early, the Gemini or the Apollo program, or where they were working on Skylab. But there's also the side that NASA, NASA's engineering and science technology team, their job is to do science and technology and engineering and achieve great things. They aren't always in the conservation and preservation business. Here on site, to give you an example, I realize it's kind of a wonky answer, but here on site at our facility, we have a group of volunteers who worked with an engineering firm here in Huntsville that was the engineering firm that built the Astro 1 payload that flew in the shuttle era. It was actually the first payload that was put together, built and managed through Huntsville. So this payload, Astro 1, was an early space observation platform. It was a large structure that supported 3 ultraviolet space telescopes, and eventually, in a secondary mission, an X-ray telescope that was positioned in the payload bay of the shuttle. It went up, it deployed, it took readings. It then was reinserted into the payload bay and brought back to Earth. An amazing project. The volunteers working on this project were able to find pieces of that early platform that had been accessed by the government as excess property. It was accessed by NASA, and they were able to buy it back. It was headed to the scrapyard. And in some instances, there are pieces that are held back and kept, and clearly they are of historical significance. But not everything is in that category. Otherwise, we would just be overrun with stuff. Here at the Space and Rocket Center, we have the test artifact from the dynamic testing of the Saturn V program. Our Saturn V rocket was for testing and vibration testings. It was not intended to fly, but it is a perfect test replica. Clearly, NASA did not access that. They held on to it. But there are many other pieces that are often lost to history. So we try, as an institution, we try and look at items that are being offered for excess to see, is this something that we would want to take and conserve? As are other science museums, we're a NASA visitor center, other visitor centers are looking at those items. But the answer is, it's sort of like in your day-to-day life. How do you decide what you keep and what you part with, because you just don't have enough room for everything you've ever accumulated? And I'm sorry, that's way too long of a question, but it just struck a nerve with me, because just this past week, we had a media event where these volunteers have, through their tenacity, brought this early shuttle payload back to the public. And it'll be on display with us for a couple of years as they work to integrate some of the additional telescopes. And then I believe its final home will be the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington. And that was a volunteer effort of love from these engineers who had worked that program.
No, I think that's a beautiful answer. I love the way you took what is a very complex and difficult philosophical dilemma and kind of boiled it down to how we deal with our own things that we keep. How do you decide what to save and not to save? So no, very, very nice answer. Thank you for that. Here's sort of a specific one about a lithium hydroxide canister in the exhibit. And they're asking if that is one of the actual ones that was used to board the Apollo 11. And I don't know if you can answer that, if you can remember the piece.
It is not from Apollo 11, I do not believe. It is from the Apollo era programs, but I don't believe we put a lithium hydroxide tank in there. Again, when we put the exhibit together in 17, 18. I'll have to check, but I don't believe it was specific to Apollo 11.
Okay. And here's another one. Forgive me, I'll read it to make sure I get it right. But you had made a statement when we were talking about that cable from the Russians to the Americans. And you had said at that time, scientific achievement paired with, and I think the question mark is, what did you say after that when you were talking about, do you remember the phrase? I don't either. I suppose the person could just rewind and watch this video, because I think we'll be posting it on the Facebook page afterwards. But
yeah, truly. I wish I could say I knew, but Lord knows I have so many words in my head right now.
it was a brilliant quote. I have no doubt about that. So
fantastic.
Here's a good question. Did they have simulators that they were using for training? I think you might have touched on that just a little bit.
Did the astronauts have
Yes,
simulators?
yes, I'm sorry.
Yes. They had simulations of the capsules. They had simulations of the landers, and they would practice. And in, I think, regard to the landing of the of setting the lander down and having to locate the best spot, I think I think they knew what to do. I think they knew how to do it, but we did not have like the digital simulations today where they could perform like visual scanning and visual identification of a landing site. They knew how to fly it, but then flying it, and in this sense, I mean landing it. They had to truly be pilots and identify the best location that they could see at the moment. They were trained to operate it, and they were trained to, I guess, keep calm. but they actually, it's interesting as we look at the missions that are flying now, as we look at the crew that are in these capsules. Everything is digitized now, and there is very little active piloting that goes on. Mostly it's control from the ground. Setting it down on the moon was a manual exercise in steady nerves and good piloting. And so he was having to look and evaluate his environment and set it down as best he could.
I think we'll close here with two more questions. Actually, one's a comment, the other's a question. I had mentioned that at one time we had a replica of the lunar module, not the one that's in the exhibit now, but we had it displayed side by side with the quadricycle. I think this may have been in 1989, 1990, thereabouts. But someone had commented that they brought their child to see that display, and now that child has grown up to become a pilot, inspired by that moment. And I love those stories. I mean, that's why we put these things together, right? So young people see this, they're inspired to take on challenges. They're tomorrow's innovators. And the other point here, which is a question, and this is a good one, I think, to end on. Where will the exhibit go from here? It closes at the Henry Ford on May 8th, but it will continue to travel, right?
I am not sure. I apologize. I am not sure where the next location is. I know that because of COVID and because of the impact between 2019 and where we are now, I know that there was some shuffling in the contractual arrangements of who would get it next. I am not positive where it goes after this. Again, I can find that out if you would share that with your guests through your Facebook page, because I built it. I don't market it.
Understood. And yes, COVID kind of scrambled everything, so it is.
It did.
To know, but the important part is the exhibit will go on, right? It's going to survive and tour a little more, I think. So.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't anticipate that it will come off the road for at least another 2 years, if not longer.
Excellent. Well, this has been wonderful. I'll give you the final word. Do you have anything else that you wanted to mention, or any other points you wanted to make?
I just hope people can look at that story and look at all that was going on in that time period and look at all the challenges and take heart that we as a people can do such amazing things when we work together, even if all of the evidence to the contrary would say, this is impossible. There is a lot that is presented as a challenge to us right now, but there is so much we can do if we set our mind to it. I hope that the success of the lunar landing could be read as a parable for what humans working together are capable of.
Yeah, I remember when we were talking in our pre-meeting, you were mentioning COVID and challenges in the world right now. And in a funny way, this exhibit is almost more relevant and more pertinent to our lives today than it was even when you were planning it to open
Yeah.
in 2019. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our members for your support of the Henry Ford and for joining us for this conversation. And I think it was mentioned in the comments, we will be posting it on our social media channels, so you can go back and watch the conversation again if there's anything you missed or any conversation you want to see again. But again, the exhibit is Apollo When We Went to the Moon, more than 100 artifacts, including beautiful models, detailed replicas of pieces used on the moon, spacesuits, any number of items from both the Soviet and the American space programs on view in Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. No additional charge to view it, and it will be up through May 8th. So, Kay, thank you so much for your time today.
Matt, thank you, and thank you to your fantastic members. I hope they enjoy it. The exhibit will tell a much better story than I've told of it. So please enjoy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Take care.